Hey all, it's me, and today I want to talk about consoles of yesteryear. Those forgotten relics of the past that were actually surprisingly advanced for their age. Now, I am always fascinated by video game history. I have also just realised I'm holding a pen and I don't know why. Take two. I am always fascinated by video game history. I think it is fascinating. There's been major industry crashes, there's been enormous revolutionary upgrades, and if I just roll away, you can actually see behind me, I have set up there a GameCube, an Xbox 360, a PlayStation 2, and a Nintendo 64. I also have a Sega Mega Drive somewhere. It might actually be in a box in my mum's attic, I'm not too sure. But my point is, I'm clearly into retro games. I mean, to me, they're not really retro. I didn't buy these are the things my mum bought me when I was a kid. Now, I was about 4 or 5 when I got my first console, which was the aforementioned Mega Drive. And it was a bit before my time, I'm not that old, but yeah, if I was 5, that would have been 1993. So, a little bit towards the end of the console's lifetime, certainly. It was only a few years before the PlayStation 1 came out. But I'm using this simply to show my own pedigree that I am invested in gaming, to the point that I have all these set up and ready to go. I could turn any one of them on now and start playing some games. So, with all that said, I want to talk about some consoles that preceded even me. Clearly a boomer who is very much out of touch with modern gaming, I do not understand Fortnite. But with that, let's jump into one of the most potentially legendary and iconic consoles of all time. The Atari 2600. As I said in the intro, quite possibly the most iconic games console of all time, full stop. I think a lot of people would agree that it is the true first home console. There were a few that came before, such as the Magnavox Odyssey, but all that could do was create squares. So imagine like Pong, but it could literally only create the squares. You had to use physical overlays which you put across the front of your TV screen, and then that acted as the Pong table or the baseball table or the ice hockey table, and it just created some squares that moved around. So interesting, and it's cool what they did with the technology they had at the time, but then the 2600 came out and blew them out of the water, being what is recognisably to even a modern audience a proper console with proper games. So the 2600 was launched all the way back in 1977, if you would believe, and it was an instant success, and I do mean a massive success. It was truly revolutionary. In 1980, Atari managed to acquire the license to a small arcade game known as Space Invaders. You may have heard of it, I'm not too sure. This practically doubled the sales of the 2600 overnight, and truly rocketed them to success. Haha, puns! So now with Space Invaders in hand, they dominated the scene, and a year later, they acquired Pac-Man as well, which I'm sure must have helped with the sales. This eventually led to the Atari 2600 selling nearly 30 million copies over the course of its lifespan. And all of this despite its eventual hand in the great video game crash of 1983. Now, if you're not sure what the great crash of 83 is, I haven't really got time to go into it in this video. It's a long and complicated issue that happened, but effectively it caused the entire industry to crash in North America in 1983. And it was Atari that had a hand in it. If you want more information, check out in the corner now. I did do a quick rundown of this in one of my previous videos regarding Atari releasing the licensed ET game, which was the catalyst to this crash. So check that out if you want more information, but for now, we'll just move on. So after the great crash of 1983, Nintendo reinvigorated the industry in 1985 with the Nintendo Entertainment System, or the Famicom as it was known in Japan. So clearly, and obviously Atari wanted to get back into the game, and as a follow-up to the 2600, they released the 5200. And unlike its predecessor, it was an unmitigated disaster. Adjusted for inflation, it cost nearly $800, and it looked like this. It had very few games at launch, and more importantly, no backwards compatibility with the 2600. Now, due to the fact it took Atari quite a while to develop this system and get it into place, unfortunately, it just couldn't compete with the NES, or actually, in North America at least, its main rival, the ColecoVision. And the ColecoVision had an enormous library, even though the 5200 was technically superior in its hardware and graphical capabilities for the time. Now, if you've never heard of the ColecoVision, well, you're in luck. I would be surprised if a lot of you have heard of the ColecoVision. It's a very old console. It was launched in 1982 in North America, and then the following year in 1983 in Europe and the Japanese market. Now, the ColecoVision was the main competitor to Atari at the time, and honestly, in kind of an odd way, because this doesn't apply to modern consoles, but one of its biggest selling points was actually the controller. Now, I'll put on screen now a picture of the controller, and it was actually the first ever controller to come with a directional joystick. It was also, though, yet another console that thought the future of console controllers was to have a full number pad on it, which I always find quite amusing because the level of complexity in games at the time was effectively choose which way you want to go and jump, a la Mario and Sonic. You maybe got another button for punch as well. You certainly didn't need 11 different buttons along with the control stick. You end up then with these odd-looking controllers that honestly look more like off-the-shelf telephones than they resemble any modern controller that modern gamers would be familiar with. So, whilst the controller did have these features, the main selling point was that you actually got two of them in the package. So that was one of the big draws for people at the time, is that you could play the multiplayer games. And it had this interesting feature of the joystick, so it somewhat resembled the arcade joysticks of the time that people were familiar with. However, like most consoles of its time, it suffered from poor build quality and just a general lack of quality control from the factory. The joystick itself often broke and then didn't like to self-center after you pushed it, so you'd have to constantly change your own direction. The buttons were fragile and would often get stuck down on the number pad. They would get pushed in and just stay stuck down and constantly pressing the button over and over again, and they often just broke. This was a problem that plagued early games consoles and their controllers. Because of all of this, joystick that was so revolutionary actually gave you little in the way of responsiveness or precision. Despite all of this, the ColecoVision still actually sold really well, because the ColecoVision actually ran arcade-level hardware, with a lot of the processing actually being done on the cartridge itself, rather than the console. And due to the fact that these arcade games were very popular, and as you can imagine, kids were dying to play them at home, where it wouldn't cost you a quarter at a time, the ColecoVision sold like crazy. So if the ColecoVision was the main competitor towards the Atari 5200, well, let's take a little step back in time and see what the competitor was to the Atari 2600, the Intellivision. The Intellivision, standing for Intelligent Television. Bit of a weird name, I know. I mean, ColecoVision makes sense. It was made by Coleco for the television. The Intellivision? I don't like it. It's a weird word. I don't like the way it rolls off my tongue, you know? Intellivision. It's just, it doesn't sound right. Sorry for being weird, let's carry on. Right, so the Intellivision was made by Mattel, and it was released in 1980 as the main competitor to the Atari 2600. When it was released, it cost $300 1980s, which in 2021 money is a lot of monies. However, it did actually have the innovation to back up this extraordinary price tag. So, one of its main draws was the fact it was the first ever 16-bit processor. Now, this was back in 1980. A 16-bit in 1980. I genuinely think that is incredibly impressive. I didn't actually realise that 16-bit came out that early until I did the research for this video. So due to this, it had absolutely stunning visuals for the time. Comparing to even later visuals of the 1990s, it's awful. But at the time, they were really good, and it was genuinely a big draw to the system. Another draw was that it had a really good sound card, which offered, for the first time ever, voice acting playback. That's right, the games for this console in the 1980s had voice acting on them, which, again, I think is incredibly impressive. I did not realise that existed that far back. And then another major innovation was, again, like the ColecoVision with the controller. It had the first ever directional thumb pad, or D-pad. And this was among many other innovations that were placed into the system. Now, it wasn't all good, of course. Again, like the ColecoVision, like the Atari, the system suffered from just bad build quality, and the controller, once again, came with a full number pad, which just made controlling games a lot of the time confusing. Due to the better visuals and the more detailed game worlds, the games for the Intellivision tended to have a much deeper control scheme. The D-pad, whilst amazing and unique for the time, offered 16 unique directions for control, which just ended up making a lot of games overly complex and complicated to play. A lot of people, frankly, just found it too hard, but not because the games themselves were difficult, like Nintendo would be. I mean, Nintendo hard is a term for a reason. They were hard just due to a bad control scheme, and that is fake difficulty if I've ever seen it. Now, if you're not sure what fake difficulty is, I have actually made a video about that before. If you want to see more about the whole concept of fake difficulty, I'll link that video in the top corner. Now, you can go watch that. But returning to the Intellivision, it was mildly successful. I'm mentioning it more for the fact it was the first ever 16-bit processor, it was the first ever console that had voice playback, and the first ever console that had a D-pad. I think all of these innovations are incredibly important to the industry, and they would go on to influence a lot of other game developers and console developers as well. So, like a lot of things that were ahead of their time, it wasn't a complete flop, but it didn't sell as well as the 2600, which I think partly was just because the 2600 came out sooner, and as I've mentioned, it had things like Pac-Man and Space Invaders. But there you go, that's the weirdly named Intellivision. Now let's check out the next console, from a company you maybe weren't expecting to see on this list. During the 90s, the video game industry was exploding, and everyone wanted a slice of that pie because it was very lucrative for the ones who could succeed. With people like Sega and the Mega Drive, or the Genesis for my North American friends, hello, the PlayStation in 1995, everyone wanted a piece of that tasty video game pie. Enter the most unlikeliest of companies to do such a thing. Apple. Yes, that Apple. And they created a system that they called the Pippin. And they threw themselves into this project. And that is how an apple got thrown at Pippin. Pippin! Puns! Again! Welcome to the Pun Channel. Okay, puns to one side, Apple released the Pippin in 1996. Amusingly, just to show you how successful this console was, they discontinued it in 1997. Now, when it was released, the introductory price was an outrageous $600. $600 is expensive by today's money, but in 2021 money, that equates more to $900. What, you may ask, could justify such a hefty price tag? Well, I'm going to tell you, and actually it was quite a lot. Now, despite the fact it failed miserably and was discontinued within 16 months, there was genuine innovation here. Now, whilst Apple couldn't call it a computer due to some legal issues with Bandai, that I really don't feel like going into in this video, they were trying to market it more as a home computer that could be used on your television in the living room. First up, let's take a look at that controller again. Now, I know I keep mentioning controllers for all of these systems, but a lot of them, this is where the innovation took place. Now, on what was called the boomerang controller, you can see there is a mouse ball, a tracking ball, in the middle. Now, before modern mice, that is what mice used to use to track your position on a PC, a little ball underneath. Apple implemented it directly into the centre of the controller, which meant you could use an actual cursor on screen, despite the fact that it was clearly incredibly uncomfortable and not particularly ergonomic. I would also argue pretty ugly as well. I mean, just look at it. I feel sorry for it. Now, why would you need a mouse cursor? Well, as I said, Apple were intending this to be used more as a home desktop PC that you could hook up to your television, which obviously you can do now, but at the time, TV and monitors were very, very different beasts. To go along with the fact that they wanted to use this as a computer, it also included an inbuilt web browser in 1996, guys. And obviously, because of that, it then came with a modem as well, an inbuilt modem. This was not some sort of weird, clunky add-on like the PlayStation 2 had. In 1996, only a year after the PS1 came out, we had a console with an inbuilt modem, with the mindset of both web browsing and playing online with friends. Apple were well ahead of the curve here, as in fairness, they often are even to this day. There were also a number of other features, such as an updatable operating system, full keyboard compatibility, and so much more. As mentioned though, it was a complete flop. It sold barely anything. I think honestly, mostly because people just didn't really know what to make of it. So I think generally consumers were kind of confused by this product. They just didn't really understand why they needed that over, say, a normal computer, or why they should have this thing over another games console such as the PS1. And also bearing in mind that the PS1, as a comparison, sold for $300, literally half the price. There are multiple examples throughout history with computers and devices that are so far ahead of their time, they just flop. And it just led to the console being discontinued within 14 months. That's how badly it did. In a way, I find it fun to sort of sit back and make fun of Apple because, well, it's Apple and they're an easy target. But I do actually commend them for trying on this one. They genuinely tried something new. If they'd released it a decade later, it could have scored some points, but unfortunately it came out in the mid-90s and it didn't. And Apple will Apple, so they tried to do something so different to the competition that it just wasn't really recognised for what it was. Lastly, I would like to talk about the Philips CDI. Now, see what I meant by everyone wanting a slice of that video game pie? Effectively, if you were an electronics company back in the 80s or early 90s, you tried to get in on the burgeoning video game industry because it was clearly such a lucrative and growing market. Why would you ignore it? So the Philips CDI has quite an interesting history, I feel it has anyway. It was actually made in partnership with Nintendo, of all people, after Nintendo pulled out of a contract they had with Sony that they were doing at the time, developing a CD-based add-on to the SNES. Now, this all happened due to complicated and quite silly reasons that I really don't want to get to in this video because I don't have the time. But the eventual result of all of this was that Nintendo decided to go with Philips instead, and Sony ended up with a CD-based prototype console that they then decided to go ahead and release on their own, eventually becoming Nintendo's biggest rival, and Nintendo have been losing ever since. I think we can all agree that this was probably one of Nintendo's biggest mistakes, because I don't think anyone's buying a Philips console these days, are they? Now, the CDI didn't really actually bring that many innovations to the table compared to other consoles of its time. What it is in fact most famous for is being the only non-Nintendo console that has ever had Zelda games on it. Now, there were 3 Zelda games that came out for the CDI, and they were all tragically awful. I will put some footage on screen now next to me in a little box down here, and you can see just how tragic they were. Even at the time, these were considered awful. They had... Honestly, the visual style is quite unsettling and disturbing. I definitely don't like it, and I think it's really off-putting. In fairness, Nintendo didn't actually want to allow Philips to do this, but part of the licensing agreement they had with Philips to make the CDI in the first place was that Philips were allowed to use some Nintendo characters. It wasn't actually defined in the contract which ones they could use, it was just they could use some of Nintendo's characters to make games of their own. Now, since even back then the Zelda series was incredibly popular, they chose Zelda. Although something tells me they didn't really understand why people liked Zelda games. Or, honestly, games in general, because the CDI games were trash. The only real interesting thing about the CDI, of course, other than the Nintendo affiliation, is that it was the first console to use compact discs. And bearing in mind, the CDI was released in 1991. I was only 3 years old. And it was eventually discontinued in 1998. So for those 7 years, it was there. It existed. It didn't really do much. I mean, in those years, in 1995, the PlayStation 1 came out for a cheaper price, I might add as well. And it did more. And its only claim to fame, and the only reason it's ever really remembered historically within the history of video games, is because of its affiliation with Nintendo. Which, of course, is why I'm mentioning it here. But that's the end of the rather tragic and sad story of the Philips CDI, and how Nintendo created their worst nightmare. I think that's it for now, though. There are many, many more consoles from the prehistory of gaming. A lot of them are actually really interesting, or just flat out entertaining for how incredibly awful they were. Especially with all those random companies trying to get in on the action and just making really cheap and awful consoles that provided no innovation. But this video is already long enough, and honestly, I could probably go on for a lot longer about this because I genuinely love video game history. I am fascinated by how this industry came to be what it is today, especially when it had such a rocky start. And in this era of the 80s where everyone tried to cash in on it and no one really knew what it was to be a video game or to be a console. So there were so many different people trying so many different things, focusing their ideas down different avenues because, as I say, no one really knew where they should be going with this. These days, we don't really understand that level of excitement or, honestly, confusion with so many manufacturers. We only really have the 3, Nintendo, Microsoft, and Sony. And let's be honest, Nintendo kind of sit off on their own. I mean, the big 2 have just released their new consoles, and Nintendo were just sitting there with the Switch. I always feel Nintendo kind of sit off on their own and do their own thing, whilst they leave the other 2 big boys to battle it out. Although, speaking of Nintendo, I would like to show you my jumper. Yeah, I'm a big fan. Like I say, I could go on forever, so I will actually just leave it there. I may do another video sometime about the history of video games, because I do find it fascinating. But for now, thank you so much for watching, guys. I really do appreciate it. If you've enjoyed this video and you've got this far, please consider giving the video a like. It really helps with the algorithm, and it just makes me feel good to know that you've enjoyed it. If you want to see more of my content, hit that subscribe button. I put up a new video every week, and I'm planning on continuing that trend. If you really want to watch more of my videos right now, there'll be 2 videos appearing on screen, here and here. On this side, we have the last video that I uploaded last week, and on this side, we have a YouTube suggestion that they'll think you enjoy from my collection. But again, I'll leave it there, guys. Thank you so much for watching. You stay safe out there. I love you all. Goodbye.